Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're going deep, deep into Russian history, specifically from the 19th century all the way through, the early days of the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah, buckle up because we're going to cover a lot of ground here. We're talking economic shifts, social upheaval, the rise of figures like, well, everyone knows Lenin and Stalin, of course. By the end, you'll really understand how a sprawling empire, like Russia was, transformed into a communist state.
I think our listeners will be amazed by how much was happening kind of beneath the surface of what seemed like, a unified empire.
Right.
We're going to uncover those hidden tensions, the competing visions for Russia's future.
Absolutely.
So let's start maybe with Russia in the 19th century. It's easy to just imagine it as this vast, unchanging land. I think we're about to find a much more dynamic picture, though.
Oh yeah, for sure. One of the most striking things about this period is how much Russia's population just boomed. Imagine this, between 1800 and 1850, the population nearly doubled. Yeah, going from 37 million to around 60 million. And then, get this, by the end of the century in 1897, it had skyrocketed to over 126 million.
That is an incredible increase. What was driving that population boom?
Well, a lot of that growth was happening among, well, the peasants, right? The backbone of Russian society. In fact, by 1897, around 90 million out of those 126 million people, peasants.
So you're saying Russia's population was exploding. Most of these people are living in rural areas. And, that seems like a recipe for tension, would you say? Especially if the systems in place aren't really keeping pace with that growth.
Oh, you're spot on. This rapid population growth, while impressive, it was happening within, well, a largely agrarian economy. And the traditional mir system, this form of communal land ownership, it wasn't equipped to support all those people.
Right.
All these growing families, they were putting a ton of pressure on the existing land system. Basically, you have a whole generation with very limited prospects.
You can almost feel the discontent brewing, right?
Yeah.
So you have this massive growing population. It's largely peasants. They're struggling. Meanwhile, other parts of Europe are going through this second industrial revolution. How did Russia respond to this changing landscape?
That's the thing. Russia was really lagging behind in terms of industrialization. And then their defeat in the Crimean War in 1855, that was a brutal wake-up call. It exposed the reality that modernization wasn't just a choice. It was essential for survival.
Sounds like a turning point, for sure.
Oh, it was.
How did that realization impact Russia's internal policies?
Well, it forced the Tsar, Alexander II, to finally confront the need for some serious reforms, right? He understood that Russia just couldn't remain a major power if it didn't modernize. And I'm talking industry, society, everything. This led to a series of reforms, the most significant being probably the abolition of serfdom in 1861.
Abolishing serfdom, that's a huge step. It must have been welcomed, with open arms.
Right. Well, yes and no. On the surface, yes. But in reality, it was a lot more complicated than that. See, the intention was to create this modern workforce, but the way they implemented it, it actually created a lot of new problems.
Really?
Yeah. Emancipated peasants, they were still required to pay for their land. It was financed by the state, so they ended up feeling like they were being forced to, well, buy their own freedom, essentially. And a lot of times they were left with very little land, burdened with these heavy payments.
It's like a classic case of unintended consequences.
Exactly.
These reforms are aimed at modernization, but they're creating hardships for the very people they're supposed to help.
Yeah, and this discontent, especially among the peasants, it really fueled the rise of a new ideology. Populism.
Populism. That's a term we hear a lot today. What did it mean in the context of, 19th century Russia?
Well, in Russia, populism was mainly a movement of kind of these young intellectuals who believed in this idea of agrarian socialism. They really romanticized peasant life and saw the peasantry as, the key to revolutionary change.
Interesting.
Yeah, their hope was to spark a peasant uprising that would, overthrow the Tsarist regime, establish a more equitable society that was rooted in these traditional communal values.
So they were looking to the past, to the peasant way of life, as a model for the future.
Exactly. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
But, despite their efforts and the growing discontent among the peasants, their hopes for a widespread revolt, they didn't materialize.
Why? What prevented the peasantry from kind of uniting and really challenging the Tsar?
Well, despite all their grievances, they just weren't unified. They weren't organized enough to mount, a serious challenge to the Tsar. They lacked shared leadership, coordination, and a lot of them were wary of this kind of radical change.
So it's like Russia is stuck in this tug of war between modernization and tradition, and the peasantry is caught in the middle. What happens next in this story of upheaval and change?
Well, despite the setbacks that the populist movement faced, Russia kept experiencing rapid industrial growth, particularly in the 1890s. You see new factories being built, railroads expanding, cities are growing.
It sounds like progress. I mean, was it progress shared by everyone, though?
Not exactly. This economic progress, it came at a social cost. See, a new urban working class was emerging, but they often faced, well, harsh working conditions, low wages, and the Tsarist regime, they were really afraid of unrest, so they maintained these strict social controls. They limited political freedoms, suppressed any dissent.
So it's not just about economic change, it's about control, right?
Absolutely.
It's about who holds the power and who benefits from all of this modernization.
Exactly. And as these tensions kept building, different opposition forces started taking shape. You had the liberal reformers, like the cadets, who were advocating for like a constitutional monarchy and more political freedoms.
So you form the system from within.
Exactly. Make the Tsarist regime more democratic.
Okay.
But then you also had, more radical groups that wanted to overthrow the system entirely. Among them were the socialist revolutionaries. They, like the populists, saw the peasantry as the vanguard of the revolution.
Okay.
And then you also had the social democrats. They drew inspiration from Marxist ideas.
Wait, the Social Democrats, wasn't that Lenin's party?
Yes, but it's really important to understand that the social democrats, they weren't, a single unified group. They were divided into two main factions, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks.
Okay, so both believed in like the Marxist principles, but they had different ideas about how to achieve revolution in Russia.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So the Mensheviks, led by guys like Julius Martov, they thought that Russia needed to go through a bourgeois democratic revolution first.
Okay.
Essentially, they argued that Russia needed to develop like a proper capitalist system, with a strong middle class before it could transition to socialism.
So like a step-by-step process, following kind of the historical model of other European revolutions.
Exactly. They thought that a socialist revolution it was premature in Russia, given its economic backwardness. The Bolsheviks, on the other hand, led by, well, I'm sure your listeners know Vladimir Lenin, they argued for a much more radical approach.
What was Lenin's vision? How did it differ from the Mensheviks?
Well, Lenin believed that a socialist revolution could happen in Russia despite its underdeveloped capitalist system.
Okay.
He thought that a small but extremely disciplined party, like a party of professional revolutionaries, they could lead the proletariat and the peasantry in the seizure of power. They could basically bypass the need for a bourgeois stage.
So the Bolsheviks were thinking about like skipping a step, going straight for a socialist revolution.
Exactly.
And this difference in strategy, it's huge, right? It really foreshadows the power struggles that would later define the Russian Revolution.
Yeah. This split within the Social Democrats, it really highlights how diverse, how competing the visions for Russia's future were.
Right.
It wasn't simply a question of, revolution or no revolution. It was about what kind of revolution Russia needed and, of course, who would lead it.
It's fascinating to see how these different ideological currents were kind of swirling around, all pushing for change in their own way. But Russia's kind of internal struggles were about to be overshadowed by a major international conflict, the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah, in 1905, Russia's, humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War triggered this wave of unrest that really shook the foundations of the Tsarist regime. Yeah, the Russia-Japanese War, it really showed just how weak the Tsarist regime was. Militarily, politically, it was all just kind of falling apart. And it fueled this discontent that had been building, for years and years, culminating really in the tragedy of Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday. Oh, that name sends chills down my spine. Can you tell us what happened?
It was a pivotal moment, in the lead up to the 1905 revolution. So picture this, it's a cold January day in St. Petersburg, and you have this peaceful demonstration. These workers are marching towards the Winter Palace, hoping to present a petition to the Tsar. They were asking for better work conditions, some basic political reforms, really.
Just trying to make their voices heard.
Exactly. But instead of being met with understanding, they were met with brutal force. Tsarist troops just opened fire on the crowd. Unarmed crowd, men, women, children, hundreds were killed.
It's horrific. Just horrific. It must have sent shockwaves throughout the country.
Oh, it did. Bloody Sunday sparked outrage and really it ignited protests and strikes all across Russia. It shattered that whole image of the Tsar as, this kind of benevolent father figure, and it showed the true brutality of the regime.
How did the Tsar respond to all of this growing unrest? Could he contain it?
He tried to make concessions, but it was too little, too late. Under immense pressure, he issued the October Manifesto. It promised some political reforms, including, and this is a big one, the creation of the Duma.
The Duma, so that was a parliament, but with limited power.
Exactly. It was a step towards constitutional monarchy, sure, but not a full embrace of democracy.
Right.
The Duma, it was essentially toothless. The Tsar, he kept the ultimate authority. And the revolutionaries, they saw right through it. To them, it was just a half measure, and the unrest continued. It just simmered beneath the surface.
So the 1905 revolution, it was this moment of upheaval, a glimpse of what was to come, I guess, in 1917. But for now, the Tsarist regime held on, albeit, a little weaker, a little more fragile. What happens next in this tumultuous journey?
Well, you know what they say, history often repeats itself. Just over a decade later, Russia found itself in yet another war, World War I. And as we'll see, this war really proved to be the catalyst for the collapse of the Tsarist regime once and for all.
World War I was a catastrophe for so many nations, but it seems like it was particularly devastating for Russia. Why was that?
Well, Russia, frankly, it was just ill-prepared for a modern war on that scale. Its army, it was poorly equipped, leadership, often incompetent, and the economy, well, it was struggling to keep up with the demands of the war effort.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was.
How did the war impact, the Russian people, just everyday people?
It made everything worse. You have food shortages, economic hardship, political repression. The war effort was really putting a strain on the peasantry. They were forced to provide grain and soldiers, and this, of course, fueled their discontent even more. In the cities, the workers, they were facing terrible conditions, long hours, meager wages, all while these factories are turning out, war materials.
So the war was kind of like accelerating all the tensions that had been building for decades, really.
Precisely. And by 1917, it was just unbearable. The people, they'd lost all faith in the Tsar. They didn't think he could lead them through this crisis.
And this leads us to the February Revolution, the moment when the Tsarist regime, it finally crumbles. Can you walk us through kind of those fateful days?
Well, it all began with bread riots in Petrograd, the capital. Women, they were the primary breadwinners in a lot of working-class families, and they took to the streets demanding bread, demanding an end to the war. These protests, they escalated quickly. Pretty soon you had workers, soldiers, and even members of the Tsar's guard joining in.
Wow. So it was a real people's revolution, this spontaneous eruption of anger and frustration.
It was, and the Tsar, he was so isolated, so out of touch. He completely underestimated how angry the people were. He ordered the military to crush the protests, but a lot of the soldiers, they refused. They refused to fire on their own people, and some even joined the revolutionaries. Within days, the Tsar had lost all authority. He was forced to abdicate.
And just like that, centuries of Tsarist rule came to an end. But of course, a collapsing empire, well, it leaves a power vacuum. What rushed in to fill that void?
Right. Well, in the immediate aftermath, you had the provisional government. It was made up mostly of liberal politicians from the Duma. Their goal was to establish a democratic republic, and they wanted to, continue the war effort.
Okay, so they were trying to steer Russia towards a more Western-style democracy. But were they able to hold on to power?
They faced a lot of challenges. The biggest one was probably the Soviets.
The Soviets.
Yeah, those councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants that had emerged during the 1905 revolution. Well, they reemerged with even more force this time around.
Oh, right. We talked about the Soviets earlier when we were discussing the different revolutionary groups, the ones vying for power.
Right, exactly. And they represented the more radical elements of the revolution. They wanted immediate peace, they wanted land redistribution, worker control of the factories, and they saw the provisional government as too moderate, too tied to the interests of, the old elite.
So you have this situation, almost like a dual power situation.
Mm.
The provisional government is trying to maintain some kind of order, and the Soviets are pushing for more radical, change. This must have created a lot of uncertainty, a lot of tension.
It absolutely did. It created huge instability, and neither side could fully consolidate control. And the provisional government was, well, it was losing popular support, really, because it couldn't deliver on the key issues, ending the war and land redistribution.
And it's into this chaotic situation that that Vladimir Lenin steps in, right? He sees an opportunity, a chance to actually put his revolutionary theories into practice.
Exactly. Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917 after years and years in exile, and it was a real turning point. He immediately called for the overthrow of the provisional government and said that Russia needed a socialist state.
So Lenin arrives with this clear vision and a powerful message. How did he manage to get support for the Bolshevik cause?
He understood the mood of the people, and he capitalized on that widespread discontent. He had this famous slogan, right? Peace, bread, land.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It resonated so deeply with the population. People were just exhausted from war. The soldiers, the workers, the cousins, they were bearing the brunt of the suffering.
It's such a brilliant, I mean, it's a simple message, but it's so brilliant and direct. And it addresses the concerns of the people.
Exactly. And it worked. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, they gained more and more influence in the Soviets, especially among the soldiers and workers in Petrograd.
So the stage is set for the Bolshevik Revolution. What were some of the key events that led to them actually seizing power?
Well, in those months after Lenin returned, the provisional government, it kept faltering. They had this failed military offensive, and it further demoralized the army. The calls for peace just grew louder and louder. And then there was an attempted coup by this right-wing general. And even though it failed, it played into the Bolsheviks' narrative that a counter-revolution was brewing, that the gains of the February Revolution were under threat.
So provisional government is losing control. The Bolsheviks are ready to make their move. How did they actually seize power?
In October 1917, under the leadership of, Lenin and Leon Trotsky, the Bolsheviks, they staged this coup d'etat. It was relatively bloodless, really. They seized key government buildings, including the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government, and they declared themselves the new leaders of Russia.
The October Revolution. A moment that changed the course of history.
It really did, but it's important to remember that the October Revolution, it wasn't the end. It was really just the beginning of this whole new chapter, a chapter filled with both, promise and peril.
It sounds like the Bolsheviks had these huge challenges. They had to consolidate their power, and they had to transform this vast empire into a socialist state. What were those early days like?
Chaotic. They were tumultuous. They had opposition from all sides, from people loyal to the Tsar, from other socialist parties who thought the Bolsheviks were too radical.
So even within the kind of the revolutionary camp, there were still deep divisions.
Oh yeah, for sure. And on top of that, they had to figure out how to govern this massive, diverse country. I mean, Russia was ravaged by war, the economy was in shambles, and their early decrees, they really reflect this challenge. One of the first things they did was issue the decree on peace. They wanted to end World War I immediately. And this fulfilled, one of the key promises of the revolution, and it solidified their support among the people who were, let's be honest, they were just sick of war.
That makes sense. I mean, peace, it was right there in their slogan.
Exactly.
What about the other promises, though?
Well, they also issued the decree on land, and this one was huge. They nationalized the land and redistributed it to the peasants. It was a hugely popular move. I mean, it satisfied this long-standing demand of the peasantry, and it really struck at the heart of the old land-owning elite.
So they were delivering on those key revolutionary promises.
They were.
But governing, I mean, it's about more than just decrees, right? How did they deal with the immense economic challenges facing the country?
Well, the war had devastated the Russian economy. Industrial production had completely plummeted. So to deal with this, they implemented a policy that came to be known as war communism.
War communism. That sounds intense. What did it entail?
It was a radical program born out of necessity. Basically, they nationalized industries, they introduced centralized planning, and they started requisitioning grain from the peasantry. The idea was to mobilize all resources for the war effort and really start laying the foundations for a socialist economy.
Sounds drastic, but I guess understandable given the circumstances.
It was, and it came with a really heavy price. While it did help the Bolsheviks win the Civil War, which erupted pretty soon after they took power.
Oh, right, the Russian Civil War. We can't forget about that.
No, we can't. The Civil War was brutal and complex. It pitted the Bolsheviks, the Reds, against this fragmented coalition of opponents, the Whites.
So it's the Reds versus the Whites, both fighting for control of Russia. Who exactly were these Whites?
Well, the Whites, they were a really diverse group. The main thing they had in common was their opposition to Bolshevik rule. You had Tsarists, loyalists, liberals, even other socialist groups who just, they didn't like the Bolsheviks' vision. And it was a brutal war, chaotic. And to make matters worse, you had foreign powers getting involved, supporting the Whites, hoping to, prevent the spread of communism.
It sounds incredibly chaotic and devastating.
Oh, it was. It took years of bitter fighting, but the Bolsheviks, they finally emerged victorious in 1922. A few things helped them win, I think. Their organization, for one. The leadership of Trotsky and the Red Army was another, and their opponents were they were so divided. But the victory, it came at a tremendous cost.
What was the kind of the human cost of this conflict?
It was enormous. The Civil War left Russia in ruins. Millions dead. The economy was shattered. And society was it was deeply, deeply divided.
And war communism, while it helped them win, it must have made those problems even worse, right?
It did. It had devastating consequences for the economy. Widespread famine, economic collapse, social unrest, you name it.
So they win the Civil War, but then they're faced with this whole new crisis, a crisis of their own making.
Exactly. By 1921, it was so bad that Lenin realized they had to change course, and this is what led to the new economic policy, or the NEP.
The NEP. So a shift away from the radicalism of war communism.
Yeah, it was. It was a pretty significant one. The NEP, it represented this partial retreat from those hardline communist policies. It allowed a little bit of private enterprise, particularly in agriculture and small-scale trade. Peasants were allowed to sell their surplus crops on the open market, and small businesses were allowed to operate again.
So like a kind of mixed economy, a pragmatic compromise to deal with that dire situation.
Yes, exactly. It was a strategic retreat. They had to stimulate the economy, and they needed to appease the peasantry who were pretty resentful of that forced grain requisitioning under war communism.
Did it work? Did the NEP actually achieve its goals?
To some extent, yeah, it did. It did lead to some economic recovery. Agricultural production increased, and the economy started to, stabilize.
What? I'm sensing a but here.
But it created new tensions, new social tensions. Some Bolsheviks, they saw it as this betrayal of socialist principles, a step back towards capitalism.
So even within the victorious Bolshevik Party, there's still debate, there's disagreement about the way forward.
Absolutely. And those debates, they only intensified after Lenin's death in 1924.
That's right. Lenin's death, it opens up this huge power vacuum at the top.
Exactly, and that power vacuum sets the stage for Joseph Stalin, a figure who would really leave his mark on Russia in the 20th century.
So we left off with Lenin's death and, this looming power struggle. It's almost like it was inevitable that we'd end up talking about Stalin. But was his rise to power really a foregone conclusion?
Well, it's easy to look back and think that, Stalin was destined to take over, but the reality is it's more complicated than that. In the years right after Lenin died, Stalin was he was one of several guys, prominent Bolsheviks, vying for control. His main rival, though, was Leon Trotsky, a charismatic, brilliant guy, played a key role in the revolution and the Civil War.
Okay, so you have Stalin versus Trotsky. What were the core differences between these two, ideologically, but also in terms of their leadership styles?
Well, Trotsky, he was this fiery orator, a true believer in global revolution. He really championed this idea of permanent revolution, argued that the Soviet Union just couldn't survive on its own, and that it needed to actively support socialist uprisings around the world, to really achieve worldwide communism.
So Trotsky had this internationalist perspective. He saw the Russian Revolution as kind of just the first domino to fall in the global chain reaction.
Exactly. Stalin, though, he was more pragmatic, I guess, more focused on consolidating power inside the Soviet Union. He advocated for socialism in one country. He thought that the Soviet Union could build a socialist utopia, but within its own borders, didn't need to rely on revolutions elsewhere.
So a more inward-looking approach, a more nationalistic approach, maybe, compared to Trotsky's global vision.
That's a good way to put it. And this difference in ideology, it reflected, I think, a deeper difference in their personalities, their leadership styles. Trotsky, brilliant strategist, charismatic, but he could be arrogant, alienating. Stalin, though, he was a master at political maneuvering, cunning, ruthless, patient. He knew how to build alliances and then, break them when it suited his purposes.
So it was a clash of personalities as much as a clash of ideas.
Oh, for sure. And in this fight for control, Stalin, he was the better politician. He used his position as general secretary of the Communist Party to build a really loyal following. And he steadily eliminated his rivals. He exploited those divisions within the party, played different factions against each other, and he was really good at propaganda. He built this cult of personality around himself, presented himself as, the true heir to Lenin.
It's almost Shakespearean, this whole tale of ambition, betrayal, and power.
It's a story full of, intrigue and tragedy. And by the late 1920s, Stalin he'd outmaneuvered Trotsky, he'd pushed out the other challengers, he had control of the Soviet Union.
So begins the Stalin era, a period that would really come to define, the whole 20th century. What was Stalin's vision for the Soviet Union? What were his goals?
His vision was one of, rapid industrialization and the collectivization of agriculture. He believed that the Soviet Union needed to modernize and fast, to catch up with the West, to compete, economically, militarily.
It sounds like he was driven by this sense of urgency, a fear of falling behind.
Exactly. He saw the Soviet Union as, surrounded by these hostile capitalist powers. And he believed that rapid industrialization, that was the key to survival. He launched these 5-year plans, setting these incredibly ambitious targets for industrial production. The focus was on heavy industry, steel, coal, electricity, that kind of thing.
So is this top-down, centrally planned approach, the state is dictating, everything, the pace of development, the direction of the economy.
Precisely. And to hit those targets, to reach those goals, he had to extract resources from the countryside. And that meant collectivization.
Collectivization. We talked about this a little earlier, but can you explain kind of what it entailed and why it was so controversial?
Sure. Collectivization meant taking land away from individual peasant families, forcing them to join these collective farms where they'd, work together and share the produce. The idea was to modernize agriculture, make it more efficient, create this surplus of grain that could be sold, to finance industrial growth.
Sounds like a pretty dramatic change for millions of peasants.
It was, and this forced collectivization, which was implemented in the late 20s, early 30s, it was met with fierce resistance. The peasants saw it as a betrayal. They'd been promised land, they'd been promised freedom, and now it was being taken away.
So the very people who had been, promised land and freedom under the Bolsheviks, now they're being forced onto these collective farms.
Exactly, and Stalin's response to this resistance, it was brutal. He labeled those who resisted as kulaks. He says they were these wealthy peasants exploiting the poorer peasants, and he unleashed this wave of repression. Millions of people were deported to labor camps. Many died either from the upheaval or from the disruption to food production.
It's a horrific chapter in Soviet history, this forced collectivization and the brutality that came with it.
It is, and while Stalin's push for industrialization did achieve some of its goals, it transformed the Soviet Union into this major industrial power, but it came at an incredible human cost.
We're talking about, millions of lives lost.
Yes. Millions. During the collectivization and the forced labor camps, the Gulag, Stalin's economic achievements, they were built on a foundation of suffering, of oppression.
It's a chilling reminder that progress, especially when it's pursued so ruthlessly, can have a terrible price. And this repression wasn't limited to just the countryside, was it?
No, it wasn't. Stalin's paranoia, his need for absolute power, led to a period of mass terror, what we call the Great Purge. Started in the mid-1930s, he used the secret police, the NKVD, to eliminate, anyone he saw as a threat, real or imagined. And this included people who opposed him politically, sure, but also members of his own party, military leaders, intellectuals, artists, ordinary citizens, anyone.
It's hard to even imagine the scale of the terror the fear that must have just, been everywhere in Soviet society.
It was. It was unimaginable cruelty, paranoia. Show trials based on made-up charges, they became commonplace. People forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit, millions arrested, executed, or sent to those labor camps where they faced, horrific conditions and often died.
So while Stalin's, he's modernizing the Soviet Union, he's also creating a totalitarian state, a society ruled by fear.
Exactly. He created this cult of personality, used propaganda, censorship to control information, to shape how people thought. Dissent. It was crushed. Any kind of independent thought, it was snuffed out.
A far cry from those ideals of freedom and equality that had inspired the revolution.
It is, and it's a reminder, I think, that revolutions, even those that start with the best intentions, can go terribly wrong.
We've been focusing a lot on Stalin's internal policies, but how did he approach the growing threat of Nazi Germany in the 1930s?
Stalin knew the danger that Hitler represented. I mean, how could he not? Initially, he tried to appease Hitler, signed that non-aggression pact with him in 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
That pact, I mean, it shocked the world. This alliance between two regimes that were so ideologically opposed.
It was a cynical move. Stalin, he was buying time, and he wanted to expand Soviet territory, at the expense of Poland and the Baltic states. But he knew deep down that war with Germany, it was going to happen. He started this massive military buildup, but he underestimated Hitler. He underestimated the Wehrmacht.
And when the Nazis finally invaded in June of 41, the Soviet Union, it was caught off guard.
They were the first stages of Operation Barbarossa. That was the Nazi invasion. It was a disaster for the Soviets. Huge losses, the Wehrmacht just advancing, capturing land, inflicting heavy, heavy casualties.
It's hard to believe that the same Red Army that had won the Civil War, that it was now being pushed back so easily.
Well, the Red Army in 41 was a very different army from the one that had fought in the Civil War. The purges in the 30s, they had decimated the officer corps. The military was weakened, it was demoralized, and Stalin's own paranoia, his micromanagement, it made it harder for the Red Army to respond effectively. They weren't ready for that surprise attack.
So it was this combination of things, Stalin's purges, poor leadership, underestimating the enemy, all of it contributed to those early defeats.
Yes, and it forced Stalin to make some big changes. He had to loosen his grip on the military, empower his commanders. He had to appeal to Russian nationalism, to patriotism, to get people to resist. And he had to make alliances with the West, set aside his ideological differences with capitalist powers like Britain and the U.S. They had a common enemy now.
So even Stalin, the master of control, he had to adapt. He had to change to face this threat to the very existence of the Soviet Union.
He did, and that combined with just the incredible resilience of the Soviet people, the vastness of their territory, and let's not forget the Russian winter, all of that allowed the Soviet Union to withstand the Nazi onslaught. The tide started to turn with the Battle of Moscow in the winter of 41-42 when the Red Army, with those fresh Siberian troops, they stopped the Germans.
That must have been an incredible moment to see the Nazi war machine, which had seemed, invincible, to see it finally stopped.
It was a turning point, a symbol of Soviet resilience, and it was the beginning of this long, bloody road to victory. And then you had Stalingrad, Kursk, these huge battles, turning points, the beginning of the long Soviet push westward, driving the Nazis back to Berlin.
Those battles, I mean, they're legendary, symbols of the incredible sacrifices that the Soviet people made to defeat Nazi Germany.
They are. The Eastern Front, it was unimaginable brutality. Both sides, they committed atrocities. The Soviet people, they suffered terribly. Millions of soldiers, millions of civilians died. But their sacrifice, ultimately, it was decisive. They broke the back of the Wehrmacht. They bore the brunt of the fighting. And they were key in liberating Eastern Europe.
It's almost impossible to really comprehend the scale of the losses. On the East Front, millions and millions dead, an entire generation just wiped out.
It's a staggering number, and the victory in 45, it came at a price that would shape the Soviet Union for for decades to come.
So even in victory, there were these long-lasting consequences.
Absolutely. The war left the Soviet Union, I mean, physically devastated. The people, they were traumatized. But it also emerged as a superpower. Its military prestige, it was enhanced. Its influence in Eastern Europe expanded. It had a place at the table now, but it was a place, a place shadowed by the cost of victory.
It's a complex legacy, isn't it? Of victory and devastation, superpower status, but also this legacy of suffering. It's been an incredible journey exploring this tumultuous period in Russian history, from the end of the Tsarist regime to the rise of the Soviet Union.
It really is. It's a remarkable story full of twists and turns, triumphs and tragedies, and I think it leaves us with a lot to think about. How did all of this, the ideas, the power struggles, the resilience, how did it shape not just Russia but the whole 20th century? And how did the legacy of this period, how did it continue to influence Russia even after the Soviet Union collapsed?
Those are questions that still resonate today, I think. They remind us that history, it's not just facts and dates. It's a living thing. It's made up of the choices, the struggles, the triumphs of all these individuals. And it's a story that continues to unfold. It shapes our present. It influences our future.
Well said. And as we wrap up our deep dive into Russian history, I hope it encourages our listeners to keep exploring, to keep questioning, to keep engaging with this complex and fascinating story.